everybody. Welcome once again to Quick Trivia with Mike. It's the weekly quiz show right here on Channel 955 where we test your knowledge of trivia. Usually it's a bit obscure, but hopefully always it's a lot of fun. I'm your host, Mike Brever, and your quiz master. Just sit back and relax. I think we're going to have a lot of fun over the next 20 to 30 minutes. You know, we always begin our show by giving you the answers to our three challenging trivia questions from the previous week. We also then reveal the bumper music that you hear as you come into the show and as you leave the show. And then, you know, last but not least, we give you your three new questions for this week. We'll explain how all that happens later in the show. But for right now, let's jump right into it, shall we? We began last week by giving you three questions, one of which is relatively easy to answer. We talked to you about the U2 program that the United States government had developed. It was spy planes that actually were over 70,000 feet up into the air. Normal airliners, you know, American Airlines, Delta Airlines, Southwest Airlines, they're typically in the 35,000 feet range. So this is twice that. The U2 program was designed to be at such an elevation that they would be immune from attacks by our enemies, real or perceived. The spy planes typically went over the USSR and other areas like that. Well, in 1960, the Soviet Union actually circumvented our efforts to keep these spy planes safe, and Francis Gary Powers was shot down. He was held as a prisoner in the USSR after, of course, he was tried and convicted of espionage. After a year, 10 months, and 9 days, he was freed in a prisoner exchange. The Soviets wanted one of their people back, and we wanted Francis Gary Powers back. And so there was a trade made. Upon his release, Gary Powers was the recipient of $50,000. And I asked you, what was it that Gary Powers was paid $50,000 for? Well, actually, it's pretty simple. The answer is back pay. While he was in a Soviet prison for a year, 10 months, and 9 days, he didn't collect any of his pay. And if you remember, he had actually already left the United States military. He was an employee of the CIA at that time. So upon his release, he was paid his back pay. So that's the answer to question number one. Francis Gary Powers got $50,000 in back pay upon his release from a Soviet prison. The second question that we had for you had to do a little bit with the early days of television. And specifically, we talked about the Ed Sullivan Show. You remember Ed Sullivan had been on for 20-some years. It was really it just really defined Sunday nights on television in the United States. And if you were an entertainer, if you appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, your career was made. People all over the industry wanted then to book you and to get you in on their shows as well. Ed Sullivan was renowned for controlling the show, telling singers the songs that he wanted to hear, the acts, whether it was from a Broadway play or whatever, telling them what they could do, controlled that show with an iron fist. And he really was the reason for the magnanimous success of over 20 years. But one particular guest on his show, Ed Sullivan, defined as a really nice kid. A really nice kid. And we asked you, who was it that Ed Sullivan thought was a really nice kid? The answer, of course, was Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley appeared 3 times on the Ed Sullivan Show. The very first time on September 9th, 1956. He also showed up later on in the show on October 28th, 1956, and his third and final appearance was on January 6th, 1957. Ed Sullivan famously refused to have camera angles that would show Elvis Presley in what Ed Sullivan thought was a controversial pose. Ed Sullivan kept the cameras on Elvis Presley from the waist up. He didn't like the way that Elvis performed, all the dance routines and things that he would do as he sang. And he really tried to control that aspect of Elvis Presley appearing on his show. Elvis Presley did some of his biggest hits while he was on the Ed Sullivan Show, however. Don't Be Cruel, Love Me Tender, Hound Dog, Heartbreak Hotel, all of those really, really great performances were done right on the Ed Sullivan Show in the late 60s. Ironically, Elvis Presley kind of got bigger than Ed Sullivan himself. Ed Sullivan ultimately wanted Elvis Presley back for a fourth show. And Ed Sullivan took it upon himself to contact Presley's manager, Colonel Tom Parker. And he asked what it would take to get Elvis Presley back on the show. Colonel Tom Parker, in addition to stipulating a price for a fourth appearance, came up with a list of instructions and conditions that he demanded of Sullivan for Presley to appear on the show. Ed Sullivan famously said, "Give Elvis my best and my sympathy," and he hung up. And Elvis Presley never appeared on his show again. However, rumor has it that there really were not hard feelings between the two of them. There were in the beginning when Elvis felt that his shows were somewhat constricted because of the conditions that Ed Sullivan put on him. But Ed Sullivan was famous for not holding a grudge if a performer refused to come on his show because he wouldn't live up to the conditions that Ed Sullivan put on him. Ed Sullivan felt that if you had the gumption to list the stipulations that you wanted and the two of you couldn't come to an agreement, that's fine, you shake hands and life goes on. So there you have it. The performer was a really nice kid. Who was it that Ed Sullivan was talking about? Elvis Presley. Our third question that we asked you last week was about the Abraham Lincoln assassination. We told you a little bit about April 14th, 1865, the evening of which John Wilkes Booth burst into Abraham Lincoln's box at Ford's Theater, shot him in the left rear of his skull. The bullet lodged in the front near one of the eye sockets, instantly rendering the president unconscious. And less than 12 hours later, the president passed away at a boarding house across the street, the Peterson House. If you go to Washington, you can still go to Ford's Theater, see the booth where all of this happened. You can go to the Peterson House and you can see for yourself where Abraham Lincoln passed. It was a traumatic experience in the history of the United States, the first president to be assassinated. But we told you that as a quirk of history, at a previous time, and we told you as a trick question, that Booth actually saved Lincoln's life. And we asked you the circumstances surrounding that. We pointed out to you once again that it was a trick question. The answer, of course, is that Booth did save Lincoln's life, but it was not John Wilkes Booth, and it was not Abraham Lincoln. Back in 1863, Robert Todd Lincoln was attending Harvard University, and he was returning on a break to Washington, and he was at a train station waiting to board a train. He actually was traveling from New York to Washington, D.C. He wanted to get a sleeper car along with everybody else that was getting on the train that night because it was an overnight trip from New York to Washington, D.C. In the crush of people trying to get tickets, Robert Todd Lincoln was forced off the platform and he was down by the train wheels. He was in imminent danger of being crushed by the train if it moved. And at that time, Edwin Booth reached down, grabbed Robert Todd by the collar, and pulled him up to safety. Ironically, Edwin Booth never spoke of this incident, but Robert Todd Lincoln did, in fact, several times later in his life. Now, Edwin Booth was the older brother of John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes and Edwin were both sons of Junius Brutus Booth. Junius Brutus Booth was actually America's foremost Shakespearean actor, and Edwin was a very, very famous Shakespearean actor as well. Both of them were much more famous than John Wilkes Booth. However, history remembers John Wilkes Booth because of the heinous act that he committed on April 14th, 1865. So there you have it. That is how Booth saved Lincoln, but it was Edwin Booth and it was Robert Todd Lincoln, and it was 2 years before the assassination of Robert Todd's father by Edwin Booth's younger brother. That was the answer to question number 3. Now you also know that we have a tiebreaker here that we utilize if 2 or more people get the correct answer on our trivia. The tiebreaker is identify the bumper music that we use in our show. It changes every week. I hope you paid attention when the show started today. If not, pay very close attention when the show ends today, because identifying that bumper music could put you in the winner's circle for the very first time. This past week, the bumper music was What a Wonderful World. And of course, it was the arrangement made famous by Louis Armstrong. Many of you may know What a Wonderful World because Israel Kamachukwewa Ole, a very, very famous Hawaiian entertainer, combined Over the Rainbow with What a Wonderful World. You will instantly know it, however, from the Louis Armstrong version, because Israel Kamachukwewa Ole did his on a ukulele, and he sings solo. Just a wonderful, wonderful rendition. I encourage you to listen to either one. Revisit Louis Armstrong's or listen to Israel's. It's a beautiful song, and I really think you're going to love it if you listen to the whole thing. We had 3 winners this week. We actually, we had 3 winners. We had a 4th that only had 1 question wrong, but we had 3 that got all 3 right and identified the bumper music. Sandra and Peter Meyer, Teresa Sundberg, and Kelvin Schrader. All 3 returned to the winner's circle, and you will see them again this week at the end of the show and all week long right here on Channel 955. Our congratulations to them. And welcome back to the Quick Trivia with Mike Winner's Circle. Now let's move on to this week's questions, shall we? I think we've got 3 that you're really, really going to like. We're going to begin by delving a little bit into not ancient history, but not contemporary either. This goes back to an era of approximately 1945 to about 1990. We're going to talk a little bit about the Iron Curtain. It was that sphere of influence that came down around East Europe that the Soviet Union instituted in post-World War II. It actually precipitated the Cold War, which lasted from 1945 to 1991. The term symbolizes the efforts of the Soviet Union, known as the USSR, to block itself and its satellite countries that were connected by influence or finances to the Soviet Union, while the West formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to create their own sphere of influence. The phrase Iron Curtain was famously made famous by Winston Churchill in his Sinews of Peace address given on March 5th, 1946. He gave the address at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. So ironically, although he's a world-renowned British politician, he gave one of his most famous speeches right here in Fulton, Missouri. And he coined the term the Iron Curtain. He specifically said, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. And that term Iron Curtain became synonymous with political spheres of influence from that day forward. The Iron Curtain served to keep people in and also to keep information out. The Soviet Union didn't want people to know what life on the outside was like, so they closely monitored newspapers and radio and television to make sure that the East was the East and the West was the West. Ironically, the Soviets took great umbrage at the use of the term Iron Curtain. And Andrei Zhdanov actually gave a speech shortly after Churchill's where he said, "Hard as bourgeois politicians and writers may strive to conceal the truth of the achievements of the Soviet order and Soviet culture, hard as they may strive to erect an iron curtain to keep the truth about the Soviet Union from penetrating abroad, hard as they may strive to belittle the genuine growth and scope of the Soviet Union, all their efforts are foredoomed to failure." So you see, there was a lot of give and take in those days between the NATO alliance and the Soviet alliance to try to get the upper hand in the propaganda, if you will, about the Iron Curtain. My question for you is that the Iron Curtain had a synonymous term for a sphere of influence that was descending in Asian countries because of China's attempts to expand their growth. What term was used in the Asian countries to identify that sphere of influence that was synonymous with the Iron Curtain in the European alliances? That's question number one. Question number two. We're going to talk a little bit about culture, contemporary culture. Specifically, we're going to be talking a little bit about one of America's greatest novelists, specifically Norman Mailer. Norman Mailer was born on January 31st, 1923, and he passed away on November 10th, 2007. He was an American novelist, journalist, essayist, playwright, filmmaker, and he also was an actor. In his career of spanning over 6 decades, Mailer had 11 best-selling books. He also was a veteran of World War II. He was a Marine. Maybe Army, I'm not certain. I'd have to look that up.
Yeah.
He actually won 2 Pulitzer Prizes during his career as a novelist. He won his first for Armies of the Night in 1968. He won his second for The Executioner's Song, a 1979 novel that he did. He actually was an innovator of creative nonfiction or new journalism, along with such really notable authors as Truman Capote, Joan Didion, Hunter Thomas, Tom Wolfe. All of them really went off into this new journalism. In 1955, in his efforts as a journalist, he founded the Village Voice. He also delved into politics a little bit. In 1969, he had an unsuccessful campaign for mayor of the city of New York. I believe he actually came in 5th out of 6 candidates, so truly politics was not his calling. Mailer was married 6 times and he had 9 children. Rumor has it that the first marriage was before he entered the military in an attempt to get an exemption from having to fulfill his service. However, he did in fact have to respond to the draft. He actually served heroically. And at the end of the war, he ended up being stationed in Japan for a while as a correspondent, reporting back. So, you know, in spite of his efforts to try to avoid military service, he lived up to the best character of the military. So it really was a unique situation for Mailer. And, I mean, he really helped define culture in the 50s and the 60s. In filmmaking, he directed 3 improvisational films: Wild 90, Beyond the Law, and Maidstone. He's not really known very well as a filmmaker, and so those types of things are not what he is best known for. His best work actually was as a screenplay writer, and it was for Once Upon a Time in America, starring Robert De Niro. That probably was the most famous film that he ever worked on. And of course it had nothing whatsoever to do with the films that he produced. The other notable film we talked about 2 weeks ago, Cinderella Man, he was a technical consultant to Ron Howard in the making of that film. Now all of these things are really interesting involving Norman Mailer, but my question to you is that Norman Mailer had a very famous quote about how to find the truth in life. How did Norman Mailer define that a man should find the truth? That's question number 2. Question number 3 really involves another time span that was similar to Norman Mailer's time as a novelist. We're going to talk a little bit about F. Lee Bailey, the noted defense attorney. Everybody knows for the famous cases that he handled. F. Lee Bailey, Francis Lee Bailey actually, was born June 10th, 1933, and I believe he's still alive. I mean, you know, he's best known for representing such people as O.J. Simpson in his 1995 murder trial. For most of his career, he was licensed in Florida and in Massachusetts. However, ultimately, he was disbarred in Florida and Massachusetts. He's unable to practice law right now. And actually, I believe it was in 2015 or 2016, he declared bankruptcy. I mean, he's literally living off of a girlfriend right now because fate has not been kind to him as he has gone into his golden years. Bailey attended Cardigan Mountain School and then Kimball Union Academy. He briefly attended Harvard, but he ultimately went to Boston University where he got his law degree. He graduated with his LLB in 1960. Brilliant man. He was ranked first in his class. The very first big case he took on was the Sam Shepard murder trial. We talked about this several weeks ago as well. The Sam Shepard murder trial was the prototype for the television series starring David Jansen, The Fugitive, and ultimately the the movies that starred Harrison Ford and Tommy Lee Jones. The Fugitive movies and television series was the Hollywood's version of the Sam Shepard murder trial. The next really, really big case he took on was the defense of Albert DeSalvo, commonly known as the Boston Strangler. Now, ironically, he's best known because although Albert DeSalvo was ultimately found guilty, he was never found guilty of the Boston Strangler murders, in spite of the fact that he admitted to the fact that he did them. He actually was in jail for assaults known as the Green Man incidents. During the investigation corroborating his guilt in that incident, he was found guilty of the Boston Strangler, or he admitted to the Boston Strangler murders. F. Lee Bailey got him found not guilty of those, but he was found guilty of the Green Man incidents. The next big one for F. Lee Bailey was Lieutenant William Calley. He actually represented Captain Ernest Medina, and this involved the My Lai massacre. Through the efforts of F. Lee Bailey, Ernest Medina was exonerated. Captain Medina was exonerated of his role during his court-martial. Lieutenant Calley was basically found solely responsible for the massacre of all those innocents at My Lai. And of course, you know the case that he is potentially best famous for in his career, the O.J. Simpson murder trial. It was his famous cross-examination of Lieutenant Mark Furman that really, in people's minds, sealed the case. He famously said to Lieutenant Mark Furman, "Marine to Marine, tell me that you've never used derogatory terms towards ethnic and racial minorities." Mark Furman denied that he had ever used racial terms to define minorities. And F. Lee Bailey was able to demonstrate that he had. There was eyewitness testimony of Mark Furman doing that. Many people from that point on believed that O.J. Simpson was being framed by the Los Angeles Police Department. And as a result of that, we're going to take a brief. As a result of that, a lot of people believe that Mark Furman really set up O.J. Simpson, and O.J. Simpson was innocent. People believe to this day that F. Lee Bailey was primarily responsible for getting O.J. Simpson off. Bailey also attracted some minor attention because he kept a silver flask on the defense table throughout the entire trial. To this day, his fellow attorneys claim that there was nothing in the flask but coffee. But it showed that he was confident enough in his defense of O.J. Simpson that it really didn't matter to him what people thought of him as he was trying the case. That's a little bit about the background of F. Lee Bailey. He also had another extremely famous client who actually was ultimately found guilty. That client famously said after they were found guilty, "I wonder if I ever had a chance." Who is that client who said of the defense that F. Lee Bailey presented, "I wonder if I ever had a chance"? Well, there you have it, folks. Those are our 3 questions for this week. You can get your answers to me in any one of a number of ways. You can email me at mbraver@eastcastleplace.com. You can call me at my desk phone at 963-8425. You know, as always, I gave you that information way too fast. Call the front desk. They'll give you my email address or my phone number. You can call or you can write me. You can also write your answers down along with the bumper music and have the concierge put it in my mailbox. I will get it on Monday when I come into work. In addition to that, you could write them down on a slip of paper and slide them under my door. Now get your answers to me by noon on Monday. Maybe you can enter the winner circle this coming week and be the champion of Quick Trivia with Mike. I'd like to thank everybody here at Channel 955 for their help in putting Quick Trivia with Mike on. Our president of Channel 955, Tyler Gudix, our executive producer, Laura Wengler, my producer and cameraman, Scott McFerrin, and also my artistic director, Cooper Ledvina. And as always, you know that Cooper and Scott, they do a wonderful job behind the scenes in helping me do research on a lot of these things as well. So if you're having a good time with this show, thank Cooper and Scott if you happen to get a chance to see them. That's our show for this week. Until next week, I'm your host and quiz master, Mike Brever. This is Quick Trivia with Mike. I ask you all to please be safe, be smart, and be patient. We will all be together again very, very soon, enjoying that wonderful East Castle Place hospitality. Until next time, so long, everybody.